Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Emily Reynolds. I'm Assistant Director at the Wheatley Institution, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to the 10th Annual Truman G. Madsen Lecture on Eternal Man. I'm going to read a little bit about this, and the reason I'm going to read it instead of trying to say it is that Truman G. Madsen, who is the founding senior fellow of the Wheatley Institution, is also my father. And I've been feeling really sentimental today, and the people who are at dinner can attest that I've been choking up and recovering all evening. So in order to try to avoid doing too much of that, I'm going to read this bit about the lecture and why it exists. This annual lecture, sponsored by the Wheatley Institution, is named in honor of Professor Truman G. Madsen, who was the founding senior fellow of the Wheatley Institution and a longtime faculty member at BYU. The lecture is endowed by a generous gift given to the institution for this purpose. Truman Madsen's work has served as a model for scholarship that combines the most rigorous intellectual preparation and standards with clear and finely honed understanding of and commitment to the highest spiritual and moral values. He was also, in all his work and all his life, true to the foundations and the intellectually transformative implications of our religion. We have kept the title of one of Truman Madsen's early works, Eternal Man, attached to this lecture series because we believe that recognition of the eternality and therefore the dignity and moral status of the individual human soul is or should be at the core of all our social institutions, as well as at the core of our understandings of ourselves and what we can become. The preservation of those core social institutions and the articulation and dissemination of core principles of truth and virtue, which provide for the flourishing of the human soul, are the essential core purposes of the Wheatley Institution at BYU. We're very pleased to recognize the presence this evening of Jack and Charles Wheatley. Jack is the energy and the vision and a wonderful support and friend to the Wheatley Institution. And his son Charles is also on our board of overseers and an important part of what we do. We're grateful to have fellows here with us from the Wheatley Institution as well, and other friends. We have special guests tonight who are going to be doing presentations for the Wheatley Institution later in the week. Professor Hadley Arkus, who is the director and founder of the James Wilson Institute on Natural Rights and the American Founding. Did I get that right, Hadley? And his deputy director, Garrett Snedeker, are here on the front row with us, and we're delighted to have them here. And I should also acknowledge the presence of my mother, Ann Madsen, and some of my siblings and children and Madsens who are together with us. I'd like to remind you that we'll be recording tonight, and if you are in possession of an electronic device that makes noises, please make it so it won't make noises, so that won't interrupt the recording. And I hope I didn't forget anything else that I ought to tell you. We're delighted to have you here with us. Professor Hemming, our speaker tonight, will be formally introduced after the opening prayer by James Faulkner, who is the Associate Director of the Wheatley Institution and a full-time fellow there beginning this fall. But I just have to mention myself quickly that having spent a great deal of the day with Professor Hemming, he is one delightful human being, and we are delighted to have him here. I've asked Professor Terry Warner if he would give the opening prayer, and when that has happened, then Professor Faulkner will introduce our speaker for the evening.
Before I introduce Professor Hemming, I want to make one brief note. It's a great privilege for me to do this, but one of the reasons it's a great privilege is that both Truman Madsen and Terry Warner were very influential in my early life, and it's made a great difference to the things that I have done since then. They had a great deal to do with the ways in which I thought about my own religious beliefs, and I'm very grateful to be at an event in which one is remembered and the other is praying. This is a great privilege for me. It's also a privilege for me to introduce Professor Hemming. I've known him for some years. I would it would be audacious of me to say we're good friends, but I have always counted him as a friend of Mormonism and therefore one of my friends. He's a professor of politics, philosophy, and religion at Lancaster University in the UK. He's also a Roman Catholic theologian. He's published works in contemporary philosophy on Heidegger, Marxism, gender studies, and sexuality. In theology, his publications have focused primarily on liturgy and the relationship between faith and reason. As we say at BYU, Professor Hemming is the author of many books and articles. In this case, however, it's true. A particular note is his translation, a recent translation of Ernst Jünger's Der Arbeiter, The Worker, Dominion and Power in English, which he edited and translated with Bogdan Kostia. This is an influential early 20th century German philosophy book that has not really been available before this in English. So this is a great service to philosophers and those who have an interest in 20th century culture. He has been for some years an academic friend of Mormonism, having spoken on campus several times previously and having made a keynote address at the Society for Mormon Philosophy and Theology, which bowled everyone over and left everyone saying, so is he a Catholic or is he a Mormon? But he's a Catholic. He's very much a Catholic, an ordained deacon in the Roman Catholic Church. Professor Hemming is a gracious and meek individual as well as an excellent speaker. He's a fitting person to have with us as we memorialize the life of Truman G. Madsen, a longtime professor of philosophy at BYU and another gracious, meek, and thoughtful person. Professor Hemming.
I only hope I live up to expectations after an introduction, or several introductions like that. I want to begin with words of thanks to the Weekly Institute, and especially to Professor Jim Falconer for this invitation to speak to you today. We often say when we stand up at podiums like this that it's a privilege and honor to be here, but I can assure you from the bottom of my heart, it really is. My thanks go to Carla Ward and her colleagues who made my coming here so easy, and to Truman Madsen and the Madsen family, and especially Emily Reynolds, who's looked after me with such care. We hit it off in seconds, and I could not have asked for a better welcome for making this lecture possible at all. The publicity for this event speaks of its intent to bring academic experts and civic leaders, and I quote this, to the fire at BYU. For a Catholic, the historic resonances of being brought to the fire could be a little alarming. It is a testimony to the generosity and the gentleness of Mormon hospitality that there could even be such a resonance never occurred to the organizers, let alone to Truman Madsen, whom I suspect probably coined the phrase himself. I'd like to begin this lecture with some preliminary remarks. Barnard Madsen's biography of his father was hugely helpful to me. And the man he introduced me to, and in fact, the man that I continue to meet through Emily all day long, I think I would have enjoyed to meet very much. And I feel I have met him in spirit. And also, not least, through the bearing and superbly intelligent scholarship of a number of Mormon academics I discover he had taught, and whom I'm already privileged to count within my acquaintance. It is unsurprising to find the names of Hugh Nibley and Jack Welsh, two giants in Mormonism, within his circle. I have witnessed more than once the peculiar phenomenon of non-Mormons invited onto Mormon platforms spelling out why we are not Mormon. My experience of the privilege you have accorded me has been rather different. I have learned much more about what it means to be a Catholic from speaking and studying with Latter-day Saints than I could by any other means. And I receive this experience as a gift, and I come to this rostrum tonight in part in thanks for what I've received over a number of years. There is so much that we share, and what I want to offer you tonight is in that spirit. I want to offer here, therefore, for the first time, some questions concerning something that besets all of us who go under the name of Christian in these present days, especially in the West, and especially but no means exclusively here in the United States. Before I open that discussion, a further remark. The little book, Eternal Man, if brief, is very rich. It speaks with an encompassing voice. It forms the basis of these annual events and is itself a unique and powerful combination of philosophical prowess and LDS spirituality. I do not wish to encroach upon the presentation it makes of the faith of Latter-day Saints. To be frank, you are far better equipped for that than I am, and I always look for points where we can meet, not diverge. And I don't mean by that that I read it and diverged from it. What I mean is that there were many things in it I didn't fully understand and wanted to understand better. And so I'm trying to say in a clumsy academic sort of way that I've come here to learn as well as to say something. What would, or at least ought, to strike any Catholic reading this text, Eternal Man, is the extent to which this book, most deeply understood, I think, is really a dialogue between Truman Madsen and Joseph Smith, his prophet. Catholicism is rich in religious founders, St. Benedict, St. Dominic, St. Francis, and Teresa of Avila, to name but a few. We are, and this is something I recognized as soon as I began to understand who Joseph Smith was. You know, we speak in the Catholic tradition of having been shaped, not just by God and in Christ, but also by those in a particular tradition in which we stand. If we're a Benedictine monk, by St. Benedict. And every Mormon I've ever met is shaped, it seems to me, strongly in the spirit of Joseph Smith. If Mormonism is one of the newest expressions of Christianity, it manages to accomplish what many Christian traditions increasingly forget to do, and it does so first in the person of Joseph Smith. It reaches into the very soil of history, and it unearths precious things long hidden, but still at work, still, even if they are somewhat occluded, full of power. Mormonism and Truman Madsen's experience of it through this dialogue with Joseph Smith that I read reaches right back as an incipient expression of some of the West's most ancient ideas. Incipient means they still speak now, and all over again, right from the beginning, that foundational understanding that constitutes history itself. History, understood like this, is not the mere narration of events in their succession. It is altogether greater and other. It is how that beginning still conditions the experience of the whole, of all that we are. And it is that I want to touch upon tonight and be in dialogue with. Now, right there in the preface to Eternal Man, Madsen quotes Joseph Smith. By contraries, truth is made manifest. No reference is given, but the quotation comes from a letter of Joseph Smith's to Daniel Rupp of 1844, and he's citing the prophet Jeremiah. Madsen may have been working from memory when he wrote it, for the exact words of the letter are, by proving contraries. By proving contraries, truth is made manifest. Now, I take the modification to be important. Madsen was trying to cover up, I think, something that we could otherwise have misheard, because we hear the word proving in a modern way. We hear proving in the sense of geometrical demonstration, the resolution of a question of the operation of the mind. But this is not what I think Joseph Smith meant by proving. An older sense is intended, living. What he's speaking of is the lived experience of bearing through our day-to-day lives and holding in place contraries. This is what I think it means to be human, which is, and it's also what it means to have a human life. Such a sentence could have come from any of those that we call the pre-Socratics, the earliest thinkers in the West. The question is how and in whom are such contraries proved? I mean, that's one of the fascinating things about the way in which Joseph Smith reaches right into the soil of Western thinking. That's who we are, by the way. I just to annoy some of my students, I tell them I'm completely and utterly Eurocentric. But I don't mean it in terms of a hegemony. I mean it by what it means to be steeped in history, to be authentically who you are. Joseph Smith reopens actually by simply setting aside the traditional creedal Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo. And in this simple gesture, he sets aside the unforgiving nexus of causality that has often constituted the history of metaphysics and defined an agonistic confrontation of necessity with free will. You know, it's the problem that Kant collides against, for instance. Now, Madsen begins in this spirit of proving contraries by living them, by saying there is no creation from nothing, there is ordering of elements. Now, this could have come straight from the pages of the Pre-Socratics. Tonight, I want to speak to you not as a theologian, but as a thinker, one schooled, I could only wish more adequately, in the history of thinking and in philosophy. I want to present to you in a very preliminary form, and for me the first time in public, some ideas that have beset me for a very long time. I hope this will eventually take a more technical form, and some of the parts of my paper are a little technical, and I ask you to forgive me for that. But tonight I will try to be more general. When my students hear that, by the way, they quail. Why? The question of the eternal, the question of time as such, and the question of who man or the human being is, are, as Madsen clearly knew all too well, perhaps the greatest challenges in thinking that ever stand before us. The mere ability to measure time as it stands on the clock or the succession of nows, so much does not resolve the meaning of time as to cover over the possibility of its resolution altogether. Similarly, merely biological conceptions of humanity confuse not only the meaning of man or the human person, but as we stand in advance of huge medical changes that are going to come, so that there are those around who are at least contemplating the possibility of human beings, frankly, living forever, as they say with great enthusiasm. This also confuses further the question of what eternity is itself. Now, my title has a clear reference to Nietzsche's doctrine, which is his word, of the eternal recurrence, one of the most neglected and misunderstood of the things about which he writes. For a people such as the Latter-day Saints, a self-consciously historical people, you will be well aware that we stand at present in the midst of a turning point, I think, in Western life. What you could people talk about crises all the time, but I feel a real one, a crisis, as the Greeks would have said, with respect to history itself. An emancipatory politics, through what has come to be identified in the phrase identity politics, but which increasingly comes to stand for the political as a whole in the West, has come to be marked by a hiatus, an absolute and decisive breach, wherein we, whichever we is posited and so asserting itself, stand in opposition to and become cut off from every sense of the from whence we have come. You know, we've been cut off from our history by many contemporary discourses in political life. For any we that finds itself like this, the past has become constituted as a place of injury and the occlusion of identity. I don't mean to name, I don't want to go into the mechanics of this, but I hope you recognize what I'm talking about. There is very often far more than superficial justification for this sense of injury. If you were to take, for instance, the issue of race, very few people in my country understand the extent to which my own nation and its industrial genesis was predicated on the slave trade. You know, that's the sense of injury I'm talking about. But in each case, there is a refusal to constitute these emerging identities within the wider whole. This is often declared impossible. Often the establishment of the competing and agonized identities that I'm talking about, the question of how we are to understand them is marked by a mood of vengeance. The vengeance in question has nothing to do with a psychological state or outlook. It is in every sense a metaphysical vengeance, often a vengeance taken up by people who are otherwise entirely peaceful. An orientation demanded by what seems to be the moment itself, but springs, in fact, from how the moment itself appears from out of the whole. Now, there's a great deal more that I could say to explain what I'm trying to there, but I hope you've got the gist of it. In each case like this, an overpowering will to power is exercised that demands a kind of satisfaction for past wrongs that can never find a resolution. The past, as history, as it were, is declared to have no value, not because it's been devalued, but because no value dare be assigned to it. You can't go there because we're too hurt about what happened there. History comes to be without value because we become unable to know what its value has been. Now, I think we are by no means at the end of this process. I think we're actually just at the beginning. And if you are now bracing yourself for perhaps an onslaught of this kind from me, and wondering what my particular identity onslaught's going to be and what resolution I have in mind, and who I must denounce in the process, you may, I hope, breathe easily. For in coming to the end of these opening remarks, I want to ask very simply, in what way and with what generosity might we simply set all of this aside? I hope you see the parallel that I'm trying to make with Joseph Smith's gesture of setting the nexus of causality of freedom and necessity just to one side, simply by abandoning the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. I'm saying, is it possible for us to do this in the political arena that is shaping up before our very eyes? Let me therefore begin all over again, and you're going to start thinking, how often does this guy begin? With, because of the necessary brevity with which I must now speak, will have to serve as a kind of allegory. I want this evening to undertake a reading of two poetic texts that each points to something far more ancient than itself, and points also to how we may set this will to power that I have named aside. In between the two poems, I want to make some brief and rather technical points about the doctrine of the eternal return, to which my title alludes. I begin then with a translation of a poem. It's partly my own translation, but my modern Greek's not very good, of a poem most often known in English as The Horses of Achilles, by a modern Greek author, C.P. Cavafy. It was written in 1910. Patroclus, whom they saw in death's darkness, he who was so brave and strong and young, the horses of Achilles started shedding tears. The deathless nature that was theirs grew indignant at this thing of death. They tossed their heads and shook their long manes, beating the earth with their hooves, lamenting Patroclus, whom they knew to be without life, present, absent, destitute of flesh, his spirit lost, defenseless, without breath, returned to the vast nothing by life itself. Zeus saw the tears of the deathless divine horses and was himself pained. At the wedding of Peleus, he said, I should not have acted so rashly. Better that we had not given you away. What business, my horses, had you down there among the wretched race of men, the playthings of fate? You, whom neither death nor old age awaits, are yet tyrannized by ephemeral misfortunes. Men have embroiled you in their troubles. Yet the two noble creatures went on shedding their tears for the everlasting calamity of death. I chose this poem because I think it puts together humanity, eternity, and the divine in exactly the way that modern people do. Cavafy, it seems, therefore, presents us with something conventional. In this view, gods alone are eternal. There is no eternity in the life of man. Cavafy evokes a remarkable juncture in the Iliad. For Patroclus is dead, and this is yet unknown to Achilles. Homer says Patroclus is philos to Achilles, and that word means beloved. And more than that, hoi poliou philtatos, you'll forgive my terrible Greek pronunciation, among all the most beloved. Patroclus was to Achilles among all the most beloved. Who Patroclus was to Achilles has bothered scholars both recently and in antiquity. The bother takes the form of were they, weren't they, did they, didn't they, were they lovers or just good friends? Plato has Phaedrus play with this problem in his Symposium, asking who might have been pursued by whom, and challenging the suggestion in Aeschylus and Pindar that Achilles, though the younger man, was the one pursuing Patroclus, which, to those of you who know your ancient history, would have been a most un-Athenian state of affairs. Xenophon took the opposite view. They were, for him, just good friends. Now, modern interpretations line up with or against Xenophon or Aeschylus or Plato or Pindar, always conditioned by their understanding or approval or rejection of the moral probity of such relations. Here, we uncover the extent to which contemporary, especially historically Christian, prohibitions on extramarital erotic love are persistently read back into what we perceive to be the life and mores of antiquity. And in this, we could all miss the point. The schema of lover and beloved, Erastes and Eromenos, as explaining the sexual behavior of ancient Greeks is, I have to tell you, and this will disappoint some and I hope please others, unknown before the 20th century. Unknown except for the writings of thinkers like Paul Vane and Kenneth Dover and Michel Foucault. What the debate between Plato and Xenophon really serves to indicate, whenever two people write a book of the same name and then start to say opposite things, in antiquity, that tells you something's going on and something that you better attend to, and we forget this. But there's something very interesting going on here. What it serves to indicate to its contemporary audience, i.e. back then, and to us now, is that attempting to comprehend the nature of the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus in terms of the mores of classical Athens, which postdated Homer by centuries, is to look in the wrong place. Homer's name for the relation between these two men is philos, beloved, of each by far the most. This is as much as he ever says, and therefore it's enough. By far the most, or among all, suggests that there were others. They could have been men or women, others to whom the adjective philos might also have applied. But Homer says nothing of this. Now, the privileging of the procreative relationship over other emotional relations between persons is a phenomenon not even of the whole history of Christendom, but rather one that gains full force only after the Reformation. Now, I realize this is difficult for Latter-day Saints because the marriage relationship is so important for you. And nothing I'm going to say here is meant to take away from that. What I'm trying to do, nevertheless, is speak of something that I think is a historical phenomenon. Until the Reformation, Christianity had privileged only the individual relationship with God. Marriage was until then low down in Christian priorities, and its privileges historically late. St. Paul, almost uniquely among biblical authors, even to comment on it, says only that it is better to marry than burn with lust. And the traditional interpretation of this before the Reformation, therefore, is that the really unique relationship of the individual is with God, and marriage was conceded only it was only a concession to those who otherwise would have committed the sin of lust. Procreation, as the primary constitutive of the relation between persons, assumes its most exalted position only in the 18th and 19th centuries. In Hegel's earlier Jena period, and in his philosophy of right, procreation becomes the engine of production itself, the means by which history both perpetuates itself not in, but as history itself, such that human production arises on the ground of the marriage relationship as the cementing and exteriorization of those resources, he calls them Vermögen, that constitute the external world in its progress. Towards the conclusion of his Logic of 1831, an immensely important book, Hegel makes a statement that shows the extent to which this understanding of production is grounded in this metaphysical understanding of marriage. He says, Gattung ist Begattung, species, by which he means the totality of all that is, world as a whole, species is reproduction. Reproduction in the sexually procreative sense. In this, Hegel substitutes reproduction for any talk of death. He says this, in copulation, the immediacy of living individuality perishes. The death of this life is the emergence of Geist. What he means by that is death is no longer important. Now, if you're a Greek, that's difficult to hear. Death, after all, because the definition of what it is to be human for a Greek is to be thnetos, is to be one ordered toward death. This, what Hegel does, establishes eternity, therefore, materially, as the endless biological reproduction of the same. And Marxism is impossible without this move, actually. And if you know your Engels, the origins of the family property in the state, you'll know that he could not possibly have written that book without Hegel's understanding of the marriage relation as essentially the production relation. In a context where everything to secure its existence, its reason for being, must at the same time justify its existence as one that is productive, every other form of human relating becomes relativized to the procreative relation. Moreover, and I can add this as no more than an aside, the confusions and contradictions of contemporary identity politics have not managed to escape this extreme instrumentalization grounded in this metaphysics, the metaphysics that Hegel names. How then are we to understand the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus? Now, Kephafius is a sensitive but also cunning reading of Book 17 of the Iliad. Nothing is actually as it seems, and as we shall see, something important has been left out. Kephafi quotes Homer, but Homer actually has Zeus ask the question, why? Why did he give these horses at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis? Well, who were Peleus and Thetis? Thetis was divine and Peleus was a mortal. Thetis was the mother of Achilles and Peleus his father. And what's going on here is that we find out from Pindar. Pindar named a prophecy that Thetis, goddess of the sea, was fated to bear a royal son mightier than his father if she were mated to Zeus or to any of the Olympians. What this means is Zeus had Thetis dragged off and married to a mortal because if he had married her and if she had borne him a son, that son would have overthrown him. And he knew all about that because he had overthrown his father Kronos. And his father Kronos had overthrown Uranos. And so you see, when Kephafi has Zeus say, what on earth was I doing giving these two immortal horses to Peleus and Thetis, and they've ended up in the hands of Achilles, what he's really saying is, because if I hadn't, I wouldn't be Zeus. Kephafi, in other words, and he knows his Homer very well, he knows that this isn't an innocent question at all. What do the horses of Achilles represent? Well, horses draw chariots, and no divine chariot is of greater significance than that chariot which bears the sun across the heavens. These immortal horses signify the passage of time, but the eternal passage of time, because the sun passes over the heavens not once, but eternally in an eternal recurrence. That's not, that's a deliberate reference. There is, the horses in Kephafi's poem, therefore, have stood still over the body of Patroclus. Time, Kephafi is telling us, has stopped. There is in Kephafi's account a further strangeness that overturns the average and ordinary presentation of the relation between the deathless gods and mortal men and women, on which the poem seems to stand, but actually does not. The title of the poem in modern Greek is Ta aloga ton Achilleus. Now, Homer never knew this word aloga for a horse. His word for horse is hippoi. Why then does Cavafy, who knows ancient Greek very well and is very skilled in literary Greek, choose a word off the street, it's ordinary demotic Greek, for horse? If you know your Greek well, you know that logos is speaking, speech, talking. And when we put a in front of a word, we take its meaning away. So what is alogos is sometimes translated as speechless, as irrational, but it's often translated also as mute. These horses were the mutes. So this modern word alogo in modern Greek simply means the ones that don't speak, but it's become a word for brute beasts. You get the resonance. Why does Cavafy choose this word? At book 19, when these same horses stand still a second time, this time before Achilles, when Achilles learns of the death of Patroclus, at a moment unlike almost any other in the whole of Greek myth, I can't think of any other, and I'm not a brilliant classicist, and there may be some much better classicists here, but I can't think of a single myth in Greek history where animals speak, apart from this passage of Homer. The horses start to talk. Now that's why Cavafy called them alogos. They repeat to Achilles the promise of his own fate. The day of doom approaches you, Achilles, they say, nor are we to blame for it, but a mighty God and all-ruling fate. Now, given this is an extraordinary moment, what comes next is even stranger in Homer, because Achilles replies, why do you foretell my death? You need not do so at all. The horses have stood still a second time. Achilles' most beloved friend is dead. Horses start speaking and tell him his fate, and he says, but I knew that already. This is a most decisive moment. What Homer is trying to tell us is the horses read Achilles a fate which he has already accepted. You don't need to tell me, because now I know Patroclus is dead, I know what I have to do. I have to slay that one who slew him, Hector, and that will mean my own death, because those of you who know your classics will know what the prophecy that was made to Achilles was that unless you took your courage in your own hands and ended the Trojan War, you would live a long and happy life, but nobody would ever remember you. So Achilles is accepting his fate. But now we know this is the moment in Homer when he's done it. The moment becomes clear, however, not because it is unique, but because it has returned. The horses have stopped a second time. And in returning, it brings a kind of a whole, an entire unity to sight. We see something in its entirety for the first time. It shows that time is not linear, but circular. And it is in accord with that motion that measures time itself, the circular progress of the sun across the heavens in the seasons in their turn and over again. It is the decision alone that is unique. Achilles says, okay, now I know what I have to do, and not only what, but how I am to fulfill it. Now is when I have to slay Hector. And now we begin to look not at the wrong place, what was going on between these two, but in the right place. For what passes between Achilles and Patroclus is of such magnitude that it is capable of upholding and making visible this singular moment of decision. Decidere in Latin is to cut off, to split, and to separate. You see now that this round circularity of time has been cut open. Nietzsche describes the same thing, but he describes it as a moment of nihilism. This is a moment of an entirely different order. This isn't a moment of the darkest nihilism. This is the moment of something else. What is it? Achilles and Patroclus, and what passes between them, which is of the highest order, they are most beloved each to the other, found a world. They bring about a world, the world of Hellas. The end of the Trojan War will bring about the world of Hellas. It is in this that the real meaning of the term philos can be understood. Each is beloved for the other, ahead of every other, means the world that they bring about itself stands in philia, in belovedness. And it does so most dearly philtatos, most belovedly. There's nothing romantic or sentimental here. There is nothing here of driving in a passion. It signifies how they are going to constitute a world entire, each for the other and in relation to others, and still more important, that others can shelter within. Thus the words polyophiltatos, by far the most beloved, does not mean over against others, but rather for the very sake of others. This is in contrast to that world that had been shattered, or rather whose prior fragility has been revealed by the perfidy of Helen when she ran off from her husband Menelaus and conducts an adulterous liaison with Paris. And the strife, in Greek this word is nekos, that follows. Now, even if we were to say that what was sworn as the reuniting of Hellas, that all Hellas would get together and go and capture Helen back and slay the Trojans, even if that could have been achieved, what would it have meant to bring Helen home? What highest world could an adulterous partner ever have reproduced, given that she had just caused a 9-year-long war? You get what Homer's trying to tell us. I know some marriages can get over infidelities. This one, I think, was a bit too big. If Helen and Menelaus could not guarantee the world of Hellas, who could? Well, I've already given you the answer. Do we find here a prefiguration of eternal return? And if we do, in what ways? My title speaks of humanity after eternity. And what I mean is, by that after, is that eternity is indeed a concern for men and women, but not in ways that are easy to resolve. We have to chase after it. We have to find it out. I think this is what Joseph Smith's own meditation on eternity is about. And his meditation on eternity, which founds a world for Latter-day Saints, and indeed for those like me who can learn something of this. But every man and every woman is confronted with this question: what does eternity mean? Even if you turn away from it and think, but I am only mortal, and resolve to yourself that there is no eternity for you. Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal return, as I've already suggested, is among the most neglected and misunderstood of the things that he wrote about. The phrase will to power, for which he is much more vividly remembered, was of interest to him only for a short period, as the title of a book that he thought he would write but never did. Zarathustra, Nietzsche's most important literary creation, however, he describes constantly as the teacher of eternal recurrence. It was that important to him. A title Nietzsche also reserved to himself. He called himself the teacher of eternal return. Now, I've got a few words here on the history of this, but I'm going to skip them. It's just that I'm just trying to say that all the commentators have been completely confused by what eternal recurrence is all about. But there's one person who did meditate on what eternal recurrence meant for Nietzsche, and I think actually explains it, and that person is Martin Heidegger. Now, Heidegger's principal reading of eternal recurrence was undertaken in lectures that he gave in 1937. Nietzsche describes the eternal recurrence of the same as der Ring des Seins, the ring of being. Anyone even cursorily familiar with Martin Heidegger's work would recognize the word das Sein as being. being itself, that took public stage with Heidegger's publication of his work Being and Time, Sein und Zeit, which asked die Frage, the question that goes out after nach being itself, nach dem Sein. It is remarkable, therefore, that even as Nietzsche himself identifies eternal recurrence with being itself, in these lectures of Heidegger, there is no discussion of das Sein until almost the very end. What Heidegger did discuss in detail all the way, and this is the technical bit, you can sort of dim yourselves if you want a break, and it's the bit for which I apologize, but it is important, and I'm going to ask you to stick with me if you can. What he does discuss in these lectures, until he starts to talk about being, is something else, a different German word, das Seiende. More important, more specifically, das Seiende im Ganzen. What does that mean? Now, das Seiende is a nuisance word for us, philosophers who work with Heidegger, because it also means being. Das Sein means being, and das Seiende means being. So most modern Heideggerians get round this by translating das Seiende as beings, but it really, really doesn't mean that. And the giveaway is this phrase, das Seiende im Ganzen, beings as a whole. When we distinguish beings as a whole from being, or beings from being, we hear a distinction that focuses on objects, beings as things. This is not what Heidegger has in mind at all. Heidegger says Nietzsche does not speak of being as a whole. He doesn't use this phrase, das Seiende im Ganzen. We employ this phrase primarily to name all that is not simply nothing. And then he lists everything that is not simply nothing. Nature, living and lifeless, history, God, the gods and demigods. Being we name also what becomes, emerges and passes away. This is all das Seiende. Heidegger argues that it is through the doctrine of the eternal recurrence that being as a whole comes into view all over again. Now, this is really important. What he's saying is that Nietzsche lets us see the whole of being. My point here is that in identity politics, which denies the possibility of being as a whole because it concentrates on sectional interests within specified identities, nevertheless also has to rely on being as a whole. Now, the reason why I put this technical section in, I felt licensed to do so because right in the middle of Madsen's Eternal Man is a discussion of being and becoming. He obviously knew, I don't know whether he knew, it was written in 1962 and Heidegger's lectures only got published in 61. I suspect he had good German, but I don't know. He did, yeah, of course he did. But they'd only just been published, and he may well not, even if he owned them, not got round to reading them. But nevertheless, he clearly had come across the post-war American discussion of Nietzsche. It's there. Being as a whole comes into view, but you remember I said to you that contemporary identity politics can't allow this whole to come to the fore. It falls into the background. This is exactly how Heidegger interprets Nietzsche's eternal return. We are able to see the whole, but only as something which can attain to no value. It falls back. It can't attain to any value. It's not that it's valueless even, but it is a positivity. But we cannot find what the value is. And this is how, for Heidegger at least, Nietzsche connected eternal recurrence with the will to power. Because if you see the whole recede, and therefore you see with that your history, that's the point, history is part of the whole that recedes. You therefore have to, what Nietzsche called, establish new values. You have to re-establish the meaning of yourself because your history has fallen into the background and cannot be reached. Its value cannot be told. And in order to do that, so Nietzsche describes this as a weight. He says it's the weightiest of weights. At one point, he says this weight is such an unbearable thing, it could even crush you. Now, you should hear in that the modern sense of injury in the discussion of identity politics. And it's real, because there are real injuries in the past. I'm not trying to suggest for 1 second that there aren't. But the problem is that we do not know what to do with them, so we enforce new identities and produce them. And this is how Heidegger understood the phrase will to power. When everything recedes and can no longer attain any value, we believe our will to be called forward to enforce new values that will explain to ourselves who indeed we are. Contemporary philosophy, contemporary thinking, is very resistant to totalities, to any suggestion that the whole has become, or indeed is even capable of becoming visible. So Heidegger says that in Nietzsche, the doctrine of eternal recurrence, the whole becomes visible all over again. But then you have thinkers like Levinas, for instance, who are most uncomfortable with any kind of totality. We have begun in the academy, therefore, routinely to speak no longer of history, but we speak of it in the plural as histories, no longer of identity of the human person, but of identities. Every possible unity is immediately fractured into multiplicities. For what reason? Often, we say, for the sake of representation, to prevent or restrict exclusion. Totalities exclude. And to maintain the possibility of the most radical inclusiveness. We deny that the totality is at work in order to include those voices which have been excluded through previous totalities. I hope this is making sense. This is in itself the moment of a most decisive recurrence of the same. Everything, to represent a plurality, must be capable of recurring in a different way. History, as I've said, becomes histories. It is multiple. But without the originating unity, no similarity within the multiplicity is possible. This is Metaphysics 101. If no two histories are alike, what constitutes them recognizably as histories? The answer is a manner of seeing. We see them in their separatedness. We see the unity of them in their separatedness. This is what Nietzsche meant by devaluation. The head of the philosophy department is nodding, so I know that I'm explaining this in a way that makes sense, and I'm hugely reassured. Or rather, we see that they already stand devalued for what Nietzsche called the sake of a new valuation. Every assault on an originating unity within a finitude makes way for or makes space for a revaluation of the same as now the other. In each case, in each making of these new values, space is made within the totality is pushed back for the sake of some new identity. So who or what revalues? Well, that one, whoever he or she is, who's seeing the devaluation already taking place, steps forward to claim the justification, the right of a new value. This is someone. This is why Nietzsche talks about Zarathustra and not about principles. The ring of eternal, it has to be personified. The ring of eternal recurrence demands, in the face of the valuelessness of all things, those ones who are capable, who are strong enough to will new values. Heidegger points out that for Nietzsche, the nihilism of valuelessness is not a dissolution into nothingness and vacuousness, but rather something affirming and positive, and indeed, and I'm quoting Heidegger here, indeed the manner in which the whole of being, das Seiende im Ganzen, comes to presence. To return to the present, to the politics of identity, to who we are, we see immediately that what Nietzsche explains is a world in which we are now being forced to assert identities, forced into a series of the most radical individualisms, each of which is itself a will to power. But not because of our hubris, not because we're so arrogant. That's what I said earlier, that mood of vengeance amongst otherwise entirely peaceable people, but not therefore through a desire to exercise power, but through the constant threat of the loss of our identities, the loss of our voices, the collapse of representation, the baleful abyss of recurrence, as Nietzsche calls it, the failure of power. The abyss is overcome in each case through an empowering, but in each case one that is decisive. Only an individualism, an overpowering individuality, strong enough to assert its values over the plenitude of the same as a whole, can posit itself in the face of eternal recurrence. It is by seizing the moment, for Nietzsche at least, and casting it through the strength of an overpowering self, that any given I overcomes the nihilistic threat of eternal recurrence, and so secures new values or new identities, we might say. Or is it? I mean, what Nietzsche describes to me is quite baleful, to be honest. So is this really the case? Is this what we have to face? And I think it is. I think this is what is going on in our modern political life. So I return to my question. Is it possible to set this baleful nihilism aside? The question is repeatedly asked, from where did Nietzsche derive the doctrine of eternal return? And the name Empedocles is offered over and over again. The question itself is, as Heidegger once derisively said, a shopkeeper's question. It was the nearest he ever came to a joke. Nietzsche's knowledge of Empedocles was not strong. He lectured on Empedocles, but formulaically, and he derived it almost entirely from the late antique historian Diogenes Laertius, and he says nothing particularly new. But there was one other whose reading of Empedocles is much more far-reaching than Nietzsche's, and whom Nietzsche knew. In fact, Nietzsche often referenced in a covert way, and that one was Friedrich Hölderlin. Hölderlin wrote 3 drafts of a play about Empedocles and his death, and Nietzsche had known these drafts since he was a schoolboy. He got in a school report ticked off. His schoolmaster said he shouldn't be reading Hölderlin, who was almost unknown at the time, by the way. He should have been reading mehr deutschliche Dichter, more German poets. I think he meant Goethe. We know that, Empedocles is the one who describes how everything that is returns through an endless dissolving away and coming forth, not of the human being, but of what he calls the world, or physis, as a whole. It's an entirety, and it's a finite entirety for Empedocles. And actually what Empedocles says has strange resonances with what Madsen describes in his dialogue with Joseph Smith. And this is why I refer to the setting aside of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. The 2 forces that drive this constitution of the world as a whole are opposites. But because they are opposites for Empedocles, they belong together. Remember that proving contraries? We've already met them in Homer. They are nekos, strife, and philos, belovedness. Empedocles, I think, was deriving them from Homer. Empedocles sometimes speaks of storgin rather than philia, emphasizing that this character of belovedness is affective rather than sexual. And we've already seen in what manner strife and belovedness constitute a world, the world of Hellas. The world of Hellas attempts to come together in strife, and it's actually founded in belovedness. But both need to be there. Without Helen's perfidy, no death of Patroclus. Without any death of Patroclus, nothing of Achilles, and nothing, therefore, of learning what passes between Achilles and Patroclus as philtotos, most beloved. Nietzsche also, early on, about 1870, drafted plans for a play entitled The Death of Empedocles, so he knew what Hölderlin had to say about it. Nietzsche's doctrine of the eternal recurrence explains and prepares the ground for this most extreme individualism that I've described as baleful, an individualism that restricts the whole of present being to the momentary strength of the subjectivity of the subject, as Heidegger calls it. But what he really means is the moment, this immediate now. It's the now that eternally recurs for Nietzsche. Hölderlin, in contrast, and decisively, recapitulates something that we've already glimpsed in Homer. For Hölderlin has Empedocles go up a volcano, Etna, in order, it seems, to die. And his death is going to be a suicide. Now, I warned you earlier that things get said in antiquity which don't quite mean what they say. The trope of suicide in eternity doesn't mean suicide at all. There's no evidence that Empedocles committed suicide, let alone on Etna. Rather, and the other person, by the way, who was said to have committed suicide for exactly the same reason was Sappho. And she also speaks of eternal return, but we haven't the time. I'd keep you here all night. If I could, I would actually, because this stuff grips me. But I know it doesn't grip all of you in the same way, and we academics mustn't be selfish. But suicide means a change of state of being. That's what the trope of suicide means in antiquities. Now, Empedocles has with him Pausanias, a younger man, who is to him, according to Diogenes Laertius, beloved. Hölderlin has Empedocles reassert to Pausanias the love that passes between them. Pausanias has already described himself to Empedocles as his heart's sole and final friend. Pausanias is to Empedocles what Patroclus was to Achilles, and this is quite deliberate. Hölderlin's trying to tell us something here. This philtotos, this being most beloved, is at work here. As they struggle with what Empedocles is going to become. Empedocles is going to become one for whom the future is much more open. Pausanias says in Hölderlin's words, Empedocles is going to become in steadfast league with all the powers of nature. In other words, Empedocles is preparing on Etna to become a god. Pausanias is bound lovingly to Empedocles. The dramatic poem of Hölderlin makes this very clear, that this binding is also a freedom. Now, I mentioned that nexus between free will and necessity that I think Joseph Smith had in his sights in the setting aside of the doctrine of the creation ex nihilo. It's right here in Hölderlin, in this what's happening in this scene. But Pausanias will only be set free, and Empedocles will only be set free, if Empedocles also attains to what he must become, a higher being, a god. Empedocles asks if Pausanias will give him his life's blood. You see how serious this is. But this question is repeated, clearly having been asked before. And Pausanias replies, and this is a quote, I say and must repeat it, this too, he's emphasizing, he's repeating, is not a matter of today. When I was born, it was concluded. When I was born, it's not a matter for today, for Nietzsche's now, the moment. When I was born, it was concluded. This freedom is what I was destined for. What is not a matter of only today, but is a matter of repetition, as the text asserts, is a matter of eternity. Pausanias was fated for this from the outset. If Empedocles becomes a god, Pausanias can shelter under the godliness that Empedocles attains to, and he also therefore becomes free. A kind of a whole is made visible. Pausanias recognizes who Empedocles is to become, a becoming born out of belovedness and strife. Through it, Pausanias is also freed, and yet he's still bound. He's still human. And Empedocles will ascend. He will become a god. And Empedocles says, in words that anticipate Nietzsche, words noticed by Heidegger, who does not otherwise comment on Empedocles, words that free us from the will to power as Nietzsche understands it in the overpowering establishment of identities. He says this, go, which means be bound to me forever and be free. Go away, because what I am to become will set you free. And then he says, fear nothing, which means in your being free there is no loss, nor am I less to you in freedom, because, and then he says this, es kehrt alles wieder, all things recur. And what he means by that is that this freedom takes place within the finitude of being and the unity of all that there is, that thing that Heidegger had called das Seiende im Ganzen. And Empedocles concludes, mirroring Pausanias, what is yet to happen is already accomplished. This is a vision of eternity, but eternity that can embrace the whole of time and the whole of being, of all that there is. Hölderlin offers us another form of eternal return, a form of it that is much more open than Nietzsche's. Heidegger says Nietzsche and Hölderlin, an abyss separates them both. It is Heidegger who foresaw that eternal return is not an invention of Nietzsche's, nor even of Hölderlin's, nor even of Empedocles. Eternal return grounds the understanding of being itself, but this time being understood not as the whole of everything present, das Seiende im Ganzen, but of time. And Heidegger says this in one of his lectures, in the 1937 lectures, because he says this is an understanding of the whole of eternity, Ewigkeit. And then he says, das Sein. If you know your Heidegger, you will know that that's a remarkable statement. Only after Nietzsche's death of God, therefore, can God and the gods return. And for Heidegger, and perhaps for us, Hölderlin is their unheard poetic summons. What Truman Madsen's little text helped me unfold, and what I hope I've tried to unfold for you, is that we need to be able to explain the whole of being, the whole of present being, the past, the present, and the future, in the whole of time. We need to be able to understand eternity. We need to understand the human relation to eternity. And we need to understand the human relation to gods if we are to preserve the unity that is dissolving before our very eyes in the developments that are taking place in political discourse in our contemporary lives. Thank you all so much for your patience. Thank you. I'm told I'm to feel, but please, if there are any questions or statements or whatever you would like to, I think there are microphones around. You. Yes.
Can you wait a second?
I guess I just had a question about your concept of the whole and the question to the hermeneutic question, how the whole can only be understood through the individual parts. And I just kind of wondering, certainly there are issues with the current political identity politics in focusing on the individual pieces, but how can we, I guess, reach the totality or the whole and have that in mind without first looking at those pieces?
Because the pieces occur within the whole. I mean, Aristotle actually says this. You know, he says this is when he asks, what is the origin of the polis? And he says, you know, some say it's the hekaston, the individual. Some say that it's the family, the tribe, if you like. He uses a word that's ambiguous, but he means the wider sense of the family. But he says no, it's the polis. It has to be the polis as a whole, because the whole is greater than its parts. Now, what I understand to be happening in Nietzsche is by privileging the moment and the agony of the moment, even if you're calling this an eternal return, is that you lose the wider context within the moment occurs, because everything is focused on the moment of decision. Whereas it seems to me what Homer presents in a literary form and what Hölderlin was trying to describe in some of the essays that then comment on his Death of Empedocles plays and written about the same time, is that without that wider sense of the whole, allowing the individual parts to come forward, then we become focused only on the individual parts, and we fail in any ability to explain to explain what they are parts of. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but I hope it does.
So focusing on the preeminence of the whole over the parts.
No, I don't think it's a preeminence. I don't think it's a preeminence, because you see, if you focus, so for instance, one of the reasons why everybody misunderstands Parmenides, and Plato has Socrates poke fun at Parmenides, is because if you also just emphasize the whole, as Socrates accused Parmenides of doing, then the whole seems to become something over there, rather than something that you live within. The Platonic discussion of Parmenides is all about the whole is really a bit of a joke. Now, Heidegger would have said that was the beginning of the failure to understand how the whole presents itself through the parts. Because we are, if that makes sense. Now, there you need an understanding of permeation. Now, for that, you and I would need a very technical discussion. And I don't think the audience would forgive us if we got into that. But that's, so the two need to be held together at the same time. They need to be held in a tension, which is why Hölderlin's eternal recurrence is a tension which allows the individual parts. And that's why you have Empedocles, who goes off to be eternal, and Pausanias, who remains human, remains mortal, and knows he's going to remain mortal, whereas Empedocles will live forever. But these two, they remain in this philos, in this belovedness that relates them. Now that's Empedocles. That's not Joseph Smith. Really.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to attempt to paraphrase or state in a discourse that might be more familiar to us what you said and see if this resonates. The partiality, and that's ambiguous and properly so, that we express in strife with one another is continuously on the verge of melting away if we sacrifice our egoism, and then our connections one with another instantly manifest themselves, so that I'm not sure that I have the language to do this, but so that the other side of strife is always unity and is always available immediately. And it's up to us if we will climb Mount Etna and let our pettiness melt.
I think that's absolutely right, but it also means driving right into the roots of the nekos, of the strife, and understanding it. So, for instance, there are two ways that we overcome injustice. One is to demand restitution, and the problem with injustices from the past is that they are impossible to restitute, especially where they've involved injury or death or suffering. But the other way is to penetrate through to their inner meaning, and to, as it were, to relieve them of their sense of injury, for which you could even call it trust, actually. I mean, I'm thinking there of the pedagogical relationship. I give my students a very hard time, but only when I'm absolutely confident that they trust me, that they know that I'm not giving them a hard time because I'm a nasty piece of work, but because I'm desperate for them to succeed.
In a certain way, you're voicing what we attribute to Christ.
I think so, yes.
That whatever we can take that will break our hearts in the right way, He will give us because of His generosity and care. And that broken heart opens for us a profound sense of the whole.
Yeah.
And it indeed unites us everywhere. There's a passage in the Doctrine and Covenants that says, "Let virtue garnish thy thoughts unceasingly, and then thy dominion will flow unto thee without compulsory means, forever and ever."
Yes, that would be very close. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
The word forgiveness came to mind in all of that. Does it fit?
The problem with forgiveness is that who forgives? You know, in past injury. I mean, this is the problem.
The injured. If the injured can forgive.
And the problem is that how do the injured forgive? This is the problem this is the problem we wrestle with in the show.
So, do they forget the past? Do they say we can discard it and move from here?
I'm not sure. What I mean by this is it is not. I don't know how to put this clearly. Of course, forgiveness is called for. It's not clear whose voice can pronounce it. Now, to any of us who are Christian, and that was speaking in an entirely philosophical register, but to any of us in faith, of course, we know exactly whose voice pronounces forgiveness, and that is alone the voice of God in the person of Jesus Christ, of course. But outside that arena, that becomes, as I'm sure you're aware, highly problematic.
Yeah, and in our tradition, I think we would be quoting Christ saying, "You must forgive all men."
Yes.
I'll forgive who I will, but you must forgive all men.
Yeah.
And so we don't have a question of who's going to. It's me. Which side you're on.
That's very much harder with the injuries of history.
Well, yes.
Yeah. But I appreciate I appreciate the point that you're raising.
I was going to argue a little bit. I'm not going to.
I really enjoyed this, first of all. Here's something of a question, or maybe it's a comment. I want to actually go to Homer for this. So there's a way in which you can think of one of the things that Achilles does when he determines to avenge Patroclus and kill Hector. There's a way in which he leaves the human race. He becomes monomaniacal. That's the only thing there is. And as a demonstration of this, after Hector is dead, he keeps him around and drags him around. And what breaks through that, as you know, is that Priam himself comes in this remarkable scene where nobody forgives anybody anything. But Priam bows himself before him in complete submission and says, "I'm doing something that no one has ever done before, which is I'm kissing the hands of the man who killed my son." And what finally breaks Achilles and makes him sort of rejoin the human race is in looking at Priam kneeling there. He imagines his own father kneeling and mourning his death, Achilles' death. And so it's not exactly like he forgives. At the same time, the possibility of imagining a parallel between enemies and understanding a certain kind of suffering at that is what allows him to rejoin the human race. And so it just seems to me, so I love what you're talking about, because it's in the concreteness of looking at your enemy do this that he gets a wider vision through his own particularity of that which constitutes the whole. Fathers losing sons. And so that's probably not a question, but I'm interested in any thoughts you have about it.
Thank you so much. Yes, I mean, I think that's and one might say that at least for a brief period, Achilles exhibits a kind of divine wrath. I mean, we are, of course, again, as Christians, we're entirely used to a God who displays only goodness. But the Greeks would have been entirely familiar with a wrathful and the vengefulness of a God, as it were. And I think your description of Achilles leaving the human race and then rejoining it is absolutely right, and a wonderful way to explain this. And you're also right that scene between Priam going to demand back the body of Hector, and if I remember that passage correctly, one of the things that Priam begs Achilles is not to dishonor himself by doing further violence to the body of Hector. In other words, Priam extends to Achilles the privileges of a father to a son. He almost adopts him at that point. And that's again what seems to melt Achilles' wrath. So yes, thank you so much. Yes. Yeah.
Heidegger speaks of being sort of or losing your authenticity to this. I'm kind of struggling for the language here, but the vague and ambiguous other that he characterizes as the they self, if I'm understanding him correctly.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how that is reconciled with what you're proposing, that the they self is, how do we comport ourselves to others when it comes to mediating conflict such that we don't, it seems like we do have to overcome some type of barrier of labeling them as the other, so to speak, or throwing ourselves back into ourselves or something like that in order to overcome our conflicts.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to get a Heideggerian question. And they clearly, as long as we remember that authenticity and inauthenticity, as Heidegger describes it here, has nothing to do with any kind of moral authenticity and inauthenticity. And also remembering that we ourselves spring from the they self. We are ordinarily and averagely part of the they, the generality. Now what Heidegger means by that is exactly what Nietzsche means by eternal return. Because authenticity is, in German this is Eigentlichkeit, and it literally means ownedness, but the ownedness, the eigen, is an I, a self. It's where you attain to genuine selfhood at a moment, a decisive moment, where you have to step in. So Heidegger might have, he read Homer, but he didn't ever provide us with his reading of Homer. The moment where we recognize that, or where Achilles recognizes that he must fulfill his destiny, is for Heidegger, or would have been for Heidegger, a moment of Eigentlichkeit. From out of the, after all, Achilles has had 9 years of sulking. If you know your Iliad, Achilles begins because Agamemnon steals from him this slave girl, Briseis. Achilles goes off with the Myrmidons into a sulk and says, right, that's it, you fight your own war, I'm over here. And I'm just going to do my own thing. And that is a kind of inauthenticity, a kind of retreat into a refusal of the moment. Achilles has to become the genuine self that he really already is. And now Heidegger really understood Eigentlichkeit and das Man, or the they self, to relate to each other in that way. And he's taking from that, he has in mind there a reference, in fact, to Aristotle's rhetoric, where Aristotle is talking about the origin of the emotions, and the origin of, where Aristotle says, he asks the question, how do you learn the emotions? And then he provides 4 steps through by which means you learn but the one that is decisive, the one that sets all the others in order to each other, is the moment, he says, which is megathos, which is where something dreadful happens to you. The death of Patroclus is a dreadful moment. This is the moment when you become authentic with respect to what you feel. So you connect with yourself in a way that you never did before. When someone, it's also the moment when what is before you cannot be other. Inauthenticity, or what Heidegger means by das Man, is that where we just kind of averagely talk about stuff. We don't really talk about it seriously. But then there are those moments, and this is, by the way, for him, this is the proof that Descartes is wrong. That you need a world in which to discover the authenticity of the self. Because there are those moments which all the method of doubt would never get you out of. Like when somebody tells you that your dearest friend has just had a heart attack. And believe me, I know these moments myself. That's the moment when you say, I wish this could be other. And if you're a person of faith, you say, do it to me and not to them, because you love somebody that much. But it can't be other. And the only response that God can make is no, because I've done it to them. I didn't, it's whether you think God does these things, but this is their portion, their moment, not yours. But it strikes you. And Aristotle says that's the moment when you begin to learn what emotions really are. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you, thank you. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.